A warm welcome turned cold. It was a perfect Saturday afternoon in Brookside Grove, a quiet suburban neighborhood lined with manicured lawns and tall oak trees swaying gently in the summer breeze. The Wilson family had just moved in a few weeks ago, and today was the day they had been looking forward to, a backyard barbecue to celebrate their new home and get to know their neighbors. David Wilson, a tall, strong-built black man in his late 30s, stood by the grill, flipping steaks and burgers with an easy smile. His wife, Vanessa, was setting out drinks, chatting with friends they had invited over. Their two kids, Jordan and Maya, ran around with water guns, shrieking with laughter as they splashed through the sprinklers. The smell of sizzling meat filled the air, mixing with the sound of music playing softly from a speaker. David took a deep breath, feeling content. This was exactly what he had hoped for: a fresh start, a good neighborhood, and a place where his kids could grow up safe and happy. But just a few houses down, trouble was already brewing. Mrs. Henderson, a longtime resident and self-appointed neighborhood watch, sat stiffly by her window, lips pressed into a thin line as she observed the Wilsons gathering. She had lived in Brookside Grove for over 20 years and prided herself on maintaining the right kind of community. She muttered under her breath, shaking her head as she counted the people in the Wilsons' yard. "Too many," she murmured. "And that music, it's just too loud." Her fingers tightened around her phone as she dialed 911. "Yes, I need to report a disturbance," she said, her voice tight. "There's a large group of people having some kind of party. It looks like it could get out of control." The dispatcher assured her that an officer would be sent. Hanging up, Mrs. Henderson smiled to herself, convinced she had done her duty. Back at the barbecue, the laughter and conversation continued. Until they didn't. David noticed a shift in the atmosphere. Conversations grew quieter, heads turned toward the street, and when he looked up, he saw why. A police car had pulled up to the curb, and two officers were stepping out. The flashing lights weren't on, but their presence alone sent an unmistakable ripple of tension through the gathering. David's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't doing anything wrong. He was in his own backyard, with friends and family, celebrating like any other family would. So why did it suddenly feel like they were being watched, judged, and challenged for simply existing? He took a deep breath, stepping forward as one of the officers approached. "Good afternoon, sir," the officer said, his expression neutral. "We received a complaint about a disturbance." David felt the weight of every pair of eyes on him. He could sense the unspoken questions, the silent fears of his guests. He exhaled slowly, keeping his voice calm. "There's no disturbance here, officer," he said evenly. "Just a family barbecue." The officer glanced around at the scene. The plates of food, the kids playing, the laughter that had now faded to a hushed silence. Something in his eyes shifted, as if he, too, realized that nothing was out of place. But before he could say anything, Mrs. Henderson had stepped onto her porch, arms crossed, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "I told you it was getting out of hand," she called out. "There are too many people, and they're making a mess of the neighborhood." David turned slowly to face her, his jaw tightening. He could feel anger bubbling inside him, but he forced it down. This wasn't the time to lose his cool. The officer sighed, glancing at his partner. "Sir, can I see some ID?" David nodded, reaching for his wallet. As he pulled it out, his fingers brushed against something else inside, his badge. With a calm and deliberate motion, he held it up for the officer to see. For a long, heavy moment, silence filled the yard. Then, the officer's eyes widened slightly. His posture stiffened. David Wilson was a police officer. And in that instant, the entire tone of the situation changed. The badge that changed everything. A heavy silence settled over the backyard. The only sound came from the faint sizzling of the grill, forgotten behind David as he stood firm, his badge glinting under the warm sunlight. The officer in front of him blinked, processing the unexpected turn of events. his posture straightened, the neutral professionalism on his face shifting into something resembling discomfort. "You're a cop?" the officer asked, his tone quieter now. David nodded. "Detective David Wilson. 12 years with the force." He kept his voice calm, controlled. "Would you like to see my department ID as well?" The officer hesitated. His partner, a younger officer with a more uncertain expression, cleared his throat. No, sir. That won't be necessary." From her perch on the porch, Mrs. Henderson's smug smile had vanished. She squinted, stepping forward as if she hadn't heard correctly. "A detective," she repeated, her voice laced with disbelief. David turned to face her, his badge still in hand. "Yes, ma'am. I serve and protect, just like the officers you called on my family." A few murmurs rippled through the gathering as guests exchanged glances. Some were amused. Others were shaking their heads, frustrated but unsurprised. The officer who had spoken first cleared his throat. "We've got a call about a possible disturbance," he said, sounding unsure of himself now. The report mentioned loud music and a large crowd. David exhaled through his nose, keeping his temper in check. "We're having a barbecue," he said slowly, "with friends and family. No laws are being broken." The younger officer shifted awkwardly. "The music isn't even that loud," he admitted, glancing at the small speaker playing soft jazz near the table. The lead officer sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Yeah, I apologize for the misunderstanding." He turned slightly toward Mrs. Henderson. "Ma'am, unless you have a legitimate complaint, there's nothing unlawful happening here." Mrs. Henderson sputtered, her face turning red. But this isn't the kind of thing we do here. It's disruptive." It. Vanessa, who had remained silent until now, stepped forward, her eyes blazing with controlled fury. "This isn't the kind of thing who does here, Mrs. Henderson?" she asked, her voice smooth but sharp as a blade. Mrs. Henderson's mouth snapped shut. David saw the moment realization dawned in the old woman's eyes, realization that she had exposed herself, that she had played her hand too openly. "I think we're done here," David said, turning back to the officers, "unless there's something else." The lead officer shook his head. "No, sir. Enjoy your barbecue." With that, the officers turned and headed back to their cruiser. Mrs. Henderson, still standing frozen on her porch, looked as though she wanted to say something, but for the first time, she found herself speechless. As the police car pulled away, a slow clap echoed from the back of the yard. David turned to see his longtime friend, Anthony, grinning as he clapped. One by one, the guests joined in, some shaking their heads, others chuckling under their breath. "Well, that was entertaining," Anthony said, slapping David on the back. "Man, the look on her face. Priceless." David let out a breath, rubbing his temple. He should have been angry. A part of him was angry. But more than that, he was tired. This wasn't the first time he had faced something like this. It likely wouldn't be the last. But seeing his wife, his kids, and his guests having to pause their joy, even for a moment, because someone decided they didn't belong here, that was what weighed on him the most. Vanessa looped her arm through his, giving him a reassuring squeeze. "You okay?" He nodded, but she saw the tension in his jaw. "Yeah," he said, just disappointed, but not surprised. Jordan, their 10-year-old son, tugged at his sleeve. "Dad, why did the police come? We weren't doing anything wrong." David knelt down, looking his son in the eyes. "Sometimes," he said carefully, "people make assumptions about others. And sometimes they act on those assumptions without thinking about what's right or fair." Jordan frowned, his young mind processing the words. "So, Mrs. Henderson thought we were doing something bad just because we're us." David hesitated. He hated that his son had to understand this so soon. But sugarcoating it wouldn't help either. "Yeah, buddy," he admitted. "Something like that." Jordan's brows furrowed. "That's dumb." David chuckled despite himself. "Yeah, it is. Maya, their 7-year-old, scrunched up her nose. "So, does this mean the barbecue is over?" Vanessa laughed, ruffling her daughter's curls. "Oh, absolutely not. This barbecue is just getting started." With that, the tension in the air finally lifted. Someone turned the music up just a little louder, and conversations resumed. The smell of food once again filled the air, and laughter returned to the backyard. But even as things went back to normal, David couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Not really. Because Mrs. Henderson hadn't learned her lesson. Not yet. Lessons in the dark. As the evening settled over Brookside Grove, the Wilsons' barbecue roared back to life. The food kept coming, the kids laughed louder, and the music played with a little more pride. It was a quiet rebellion, an unspoken statement that they belonged here, no matter what Mrs. Henderson or anyone else thought. David tried to let the situation go. He smiled for his family, joked with his guests, and played referee when Jordan and Maya's water balloon fight got out of hand. But in the back of his mind, something gnawed at him. He'd seen that look in Mrs. Henderson's eyes before, the look of someone who didn't believe they'd done anything wrong. She hadn't learned a lesson today. She'd only been embarrassed. And people like that, they didn't let things go. Sure enough, long after the last plate had been put away and the final guest had left, David found himself looking out the window, straight across the street, where Mrs. Henderson's house sat dark and brooding. Still thinking about her, Vanessa's voice was soft as she stepped up behind him, slipping her arms around his waist. David sighed. "I just don't get it. She's lived here for decades, right? She's seen people come and go. What makes us different?" Vanessa leaned her cheek against his back. "You already know the answer to that." He closed his eyes. "Of course he did. You can't fix people like that," she continued. "And you can't spend your life trying to change every Mrs. Henderson in the world." David turned to face her, resting his forehead against hers. "I don't need to change the world," he murmured. "Just this one street." Vanessa sighed, a mix of frustration and admiration in her expression. "And how exactly do you plan on doing that?" David didn't answer. Because, at that moment, the porch light flickered on across the street, and the shadow of Mrs. Henderson appeared in the window once again, peering out just as she had that afternoon. David met her gaze through the glass. Neither of them moved. Neither of them blinked. But David, he smiled. A slow, knowing smile that made Mrs. Henderson jerk back as if she'd been caught doing something she shouldn't. Her curtain snapped shut. David chuckled to himself. "I think I have an idea." The morning after, Sunday mornings in Brookside Grove were quiet. The smell of fresh coffee and newspaper ink filled the air as residents stepped onto their porches to retrieve their morning reads. David was up early, sitting on his front porch with a cup of coffee, watching the street wake up. Then, like clockwork, Mrs. Henderson's front door creaked open. She wasn't expecting to see him there. She paused, clutching her robe tighter, eyes narrowing. David smiled. "Good morning, Mrs. Henderson." She stiffened. "Detective," she said flatly. He took a slow sip of his coffee. "Beautiful morning, isn't it?" Mrs. Henderson didn't reply. Instead, she snatched her newspaper from the driveway and turned to go back inside. "Before you go," David said casually, "I just wanted to thank you." She froze. Her knuckles whitened around the newspaper. "Excuse me." David leaned back in his chair. "For reminding me how important it is to be involved in the community. My family's new here, after all, and I'd hate for people to feel uncomfortable around us." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "You're mocking me." "Not at all," David said smoothly. "In fact, I decided to join the neighborhood watch." Mrs. Henderson actually choked. "You what?" David shrugged, taking another sip of coffee. "It only makes sense, don't you think? I am law enforcement after all. Who better to keep an eye on things?" She gaped at him, the color draining from her face. "Oh, and don't worry," he added, flashing her a pointed smile. I'll make sure to address any real disturbances. You know, things like false police reports, harassment, and targeted complaints against law-abiding citizens." Mrs. Henderson's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. David watched as the realization dawned on her. She had lost. She could complain. She could glare through her window. She could call and whisper into her phone. But none of it would work anymore. Because now, David Wilson was watching too. She inhaled sharply, spun on her heel, and marched inside, slamming the door behind her. David chuckled to himself, taking another sip of his coffee. Brookside Grove was about to change. And whether Mrs. Henderson liked it or not, it was going to change for the better. A new kind of watch. The next few weeks in Brookside Grove were different. For the first time in a long while, Mrs. Henderson wasn't the only one keeping tabs on the neighborhood. David made it official within days, submitting an application, attending a neighborhood watch meeting, and introducing himself to the other members. Most were retirees or longtime residents who genuinely cared about the safety of the community. A few, however, were more like Mrs. Henderson, people who wanted control rather than safety. At the first meeting, David noticed Mrs. Henderson sitting stiffly at the end of the table, her lips pursed so tight they looked like they might disappear. Detective Wilson, the watch captain, a gray-haired man named Mr. Price, said with a warm smile, "It's an honor to have someone with your background join us." David nodded politely. "Happy to serve. Now, you mentioned in your application that you'd like to improve community relations," Price continued. "What exactly did you have in mind?" David folded his hands. "For starters, I think we should focus on real safety concerns." He turned his gaze, pointedly, toward Mrs. Henderson, rather than wasting resources on things like noise complaints over backyard barbecues. The room went silent. Mrs. Henderson's nostrils flared. A few members shifted uncomfortably, but others nodded in agreement. "You're right," Price admitted. "Some of our priorities may have gotten a bit off track lately." David smiled. "Glad to hear it." And just like that, the balance of power in the neighborhood watch began to shift. Mrs. Henderson's retaliation. Mrs. Henderson, of course, did not take this quietly. Over the next few days, she did everything she could to make the Wilsons' lives difficult. First, she reported them for improper trash disposal. A city inspector arrived, only to find everything in order. Then, she filed a complaint about their overgrown lawn. The HOA representative who arrived looked baffled. David's yard was the neatest on the block. Finally, she tried the oldest trick in the book, an anonymous complaint about suspicious activity at the Wilsons' home. David wasn't surprised when two officers showed up one evening, looking uncomfortable as they explained the vague, baseless report. "Anonymous call," the older one said, clearly embarrassed. David crossed his arms. "Would you like to check my criminal record while you're here?" The officer flushed. "No, sir, that won't be necessary." David stared at them for a long moment before finally speaking. "You tell your dispatcher that Detective Wilson is tired of these games." His voice was calm, but firm. "And that if I get one more visit based on nonsense, I'll be speaking directly to the chief about who keeps making these reports." The officers exchanged a glance. "We understand, sir," the younger one said, nodding. "Have a good evening." As they walked back to their car, David caught movement across the street. Mrs. Henderson's curtain twitched. She was watching. And she knew she'd lost this round too. Turning the tables. One evening, as David was finishing up a run through the neighborhood, he spotted something interesting. A small group of teenagers loitered near Mrs. Henderson's house, their voices hushed, their movements quick. They didn't look dangerous, but they definitely looked like they were up to something. Mrs. Henderson had just stepped onto her porch, squinting at them suspiciously. Her hand hovered near her phone. David smirked. "Time for a little lesson." He jogged over casually. "Evening, folks," he said. The kids jumped, clearly startled. Mrs. Henderson looked like she was about to call 911. David held up a hand. Relax, I'm not here to hassle you. Just making sure you're not planning to do anything regrettable. The tallest of the group, a lanky boy with nervous eyes, swallowed. We were just talking. David nodded. Good. Then I suggest you talk somewhere else before she calls the cops on you. He tilted his head toward Mrs. Henderson, who huffed but said nothing. The teens glanced between David and the old woman, understanding dawning on their faces. Yeah, we should go, one muttered, and within seconds, they were gone. David turned to Mrs. Henderson, crossing his arms. See, that's how you handle things without dialing 911 for no reason. She scowled. I was just about to call. I know, David said dryly. That's the problem. She bristled. Well, what if they were criminals? David chuckled. They were kids. Not everything that makes you uncomfortable is a crime, Mrs. Henderson. She turned and stomped back inside, slamming her door. David just smiled. Because, little by little, she was running out of excuses. And one day soon, she'd run out of fight too. When the tables turned, Brookside Grove was changing, and everyone could feel it. Where once Mrs. Henderson's judgmental glare had dictated the mood of the street, now there was a shift, an undercurrent of quiet defiance against her reign. Neighbors who had once avoided the Wilsons out of fear of stirring trouble now stopped by to chat. Kids played freely in front yards without anxious glances toward her house. The Wilsons' next-door neighbors, the Martinez family, even hosted a backyard movie night, something unthinkable just months ago. And David, he was watching it all with quiet satisfaction. But Mrs. Henderson, she was watching too. And she wasn't done fighting. An unexpected invitation. One crisp Friday morning, as Vanessa was watering the front lawn, a stiff knock came at the Wilsons' door. David opened it, eyebrows lifting when he saw Mrs. Henderson standing there, clutching the piece of paper. She looked different. The usual scowl was gone, replaced by something unreadable. Detective, she said, clearing her throat. I wanted to personally invite you to the next neighborhood watch meeting. David blinked. You mean the one I already planned to attend? Mrs. Henderson's fingers tightened around the paper. Yes, well, there's been a change in the agenda. An important vote regarding leadership. There it is. She was trying to get rid of him. David smiled, slow and knowing. I wouldn't miss it for the world. The showdown. That Sunday, the neighborhood watch meeting was packed, more than usual. Word had spread that something was going down, and people wanted to see it unfold. Mrs. Henderson sat rigidly at the far end of the table, lips pursed in determination. Mr. Price, the watch captain, cleared his throat. All right, folks, we've got a few things on the agenda tonight. But first, Mrs. Henderson has requested an important vote. She straightened. Yes, thank you. I'd like to propose a change in leadership. Specifically, I move that Detective Wilson be removed from the Neighborhood Watch Committee. A murmur spread through the room. David leaned back in his chair, utterly unfazed. On what grounds? Mrs. Henderson sniffed. For disrupting the order of our community. Since your arrival, we've had multiple disturbances, blatant disrespect for long-standing rules, and an increase in suspicious behavior. David chuckled, shaking his head. You mean we've had more block parties, friendly conversations, and fewer false police calls? Mrs. Henderson's jaw tightened. We are supposed to protect this neighborhood, not turn it into a circus. Mr. Price looked around the room. All right, let's open this up. Anyone else feel that Detective Wilson has been a disruption? Silence. David glanced around, watching as one by one, his neighbors avoided Mrs. Henderson's gaze. Then, a voice cut through the quiet. I do. David turned, surprised to see an elderly man, Mr. Thompson, raising his hand. But then the old man grinned. He's a disruption to people like you, Mrs. Henderson, and that's exactly what this neighborhood needed. A few chuckles rippled through the room. Mrs. Henderson's face darkened. Then, more voices chimed in. I actually feel safer now. He helped my son when he was being harassed. Where were you, Mrs. Henderson? He's doing your job better than you ever did. By the time the murmurs died down, Mrs. Henderson's cheeks were red, her fingers trembling against the table. David leaned forward, voice calm. Seems like the people have spoken. Mrs. Henderson's lips pressed into a thin line. She had lost. And she knew it. The fall of a queen. After that meeting, Mrs. Henderson's influence crumbled. The watch committee stopped entertaining her complaints. The HOA stopped taking her concerns seriously. Even the local police had her number flagged for habitual false reports. Brookside Grove had, for the first time in years, found freedom from her reign of quiet terror. And David Wilson. He had done exactly what he promised. He had changed this street. But what no one expected was what happened next. A knock in the dark. It was late, nearly midnight. David was half asleep when he heard it. 3 sharp knocks at the door. Frowning, he slipped out of bed, grabbed his robe, and quietly made his way downstairs. When he opened the door, his eyebrows lifted in surprise. Mrs. Henderson stood there. She looked small, no makeup, wrinkled cardigan pulled tight around her. David leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. You do realize I could call the cops for suspicious behavior, right? Mrs. Henderson exhaled sharply. I don't have time for jokes, detective. David studied her, noticing something unusual. Her hands. They were shaking. He softened, just a little. What's going on? She hesitated. Then, in a voice quieter than he had ever heard from her, she muttered, I think someone's trying to break into my house. David's entire demeanor shifted. He straightened. Did you call 911? Her eyes darted to the side. I don't want to cause a scene. David stared at her. Oh, the irony. But now wasn't the time for that. Stay here, he said, stepping onto the porch. I'll check it out. Mrs. Henderson nodded stiffly, gripping her cardigan like it was a lifeline. As David walked toward her house, one thought played in his mind. Even the worst people can still feel fear. And whether he liked her or not, she was still his neighbor. The fear we all share. David moved swiftly, his instincts taking over. Years on the force had trained him to assess a situation before stepping into it. And this time was no different. He scanned the street. No unfamiliar cars, no movement. The usual quiet of Brookside Grove remained intact. But fear wasn't rational. Even Mrs. Henderson, who had spent years seeing threats where none existed, was now staring into the darkness, gripped by a very real fear. David approached her house, his sharp eyes scanning the perimeter. The porch light flickered, casting long shadows across the neatly trimmed lawn. Something about the way she clutched her cardigan. The stiffness in her shoulders. This wasn't a trick. This was real. He gestured for her to stay put as he moved to her side yard. The fence was latched, but as he pressed against it, the wood gave slightly, loose. Someone could have easily slipped through. Then he saw it. Footprints in the damp soil. David's expression hardened. Someone had been here. And recently. Old fears, new dangers. He circled back to the front, keeping his voice calm but firm. Did you hear anything? See anyone? Mrs. Henderson swallowed. I was getting ready for bed. The motion light went on. I looked outside, and I thought I saw a shadow near my garage. David nodded. Stay on the porch. He checked the garage door. Locked. He moved toward the backyard. Every step calculated, muscles tensed. Then he saw something near the bushes. Fresh scuff marks on the wooden fence. Someone had climbed over. He followed the trail, pausing when he reached the back alley. The footprints vanished into the street. Whoever it was, they were gone now. But they'd be back. Someone who scouted a house once would often do it again. When he returned, Mrs. Henderson was standing exactly where he left her, hands trembling slightly. David sighed. Someone was definitely snooping around. They didn't break in, but I don't think this was random." Mrs. Henderson's face paled. "What do I do?" For the first time since he'd met her, she looked small. David rubbed his chin. "First thing, get a camera system. A doorbell cam, at least. Second, do you have anyone who can stay with you for a few nights?" She hesitated. "No." David exhaled. "All right. Then you'll leave a light on inside every night. And you'll call me, or 911, if anything feels off." Mrs. Henderson blinked. "You'd come back." David folded his arms. "You might not like me, Mrs. Henderson, but I don't leave my neighbors unprotected. Even you." Her mouth pressed into a tight line. But then, after a long pause, she gave a single stiff nod. A long overdue conversation. David walked her back inside, making sure her locks were secure before stepping onto the porch. He had expected her to slam the door shut behind him. But she didn't. Instead, her voice, quieter than ever, drifted toward him. "Why do you do it?" David turned. "Do what?" She swallowed, arms crossed over her chest, like she was trying to hold herself together. "Still, help people, even when they don't deserve it." David studied her. "Because fear doesn't care who you are. We all feel it." Mrs. Henderson looked away. "I didn't always used to be like this." That caught him off guard. He leaned against the doorframe. "Then what happened?" She hesitated, staring at some invisible point in the distance. "I lost my husband 10 years ago. He was a firefighter, died saving a family from a burning house." David's chest tightened. He hadn't known that. "He was the one who talked to the neighbors," she continued. "He was the friendly one. I just stayed in my own little world. And when he died, I didn't know how to connect with people. So I just watched them instead." David exhaled, his voice softer. "Watching isn't the same as belonging, Mrs. Henderson." She nodded stiffly. "I see that now." There was a long silence. Then she inhaled sharply, squaring her shoulders. "I should get some rest." David stepped back. "You do that. And remember, call me if anything happens." She nodded once before closing the door, locking it firmly. And for the first time, David didn't hear a single deadbolt after it. The new Brookside Grove. The next few weeks were different. Mrs. Henderson didn't suddenly become the most sociable neighbor on the block, but she stopped watching from behind her curtains. She even waved once. Small steps. Brookside Grove had changed. Not just because of David, but because people had chosen to change. To open up. To stand together instead of looking at each other with suspicion. One evening, David stood on his porch, watching as his kids played with the Martinez kids. Laughter filled the air. Vanessa stepped beside him, nudging him playfully. "You saved the neighborhood." David chuckled. "Nah, I just reminded them of what it should be." Down the street, a familiar figure stood on her own porch, watching. Mrs. Henderson. She wasn't scowling. She wasn't clutching her phone. She was just standing there, quietly, taking it all in. And then, to David's surprise, she did something she had never done before. She lifted a hand and waved. David smiled and waved back. Because sometimes redemption doesn't come in grand gestures. Sometimes it's just a simple wave and the willingness to try again. The end.